Hello everybody and welcome to another hobby cheating video. This week we're returning to NMM and we're going to talk about reflections. Let's get into it.
The strict technomancer that is Vinci V. Let us get to the technique and learn it Vinci V.
When we're painting non-metallic metal, it's easy to just sort of focus on your light and things like that and forget that there are other elements in the scene, often which will cause reflections into that metal depending on how shiny it is. Now, I already in the past recorded my ultimate guide to non-metallic metal. You can check that out, linked up above. And that covers most of the basics of how you actually establish your primary and secondary lights. Today, we're going to take it the next level down. Call it the ultimate guide to NMM. We're going to focus in on specifically environmental reflections when you have a shiny surface and that is now casting some kind of color or bounce reflection into your metal. This is just a way to increase the credibility while also making your metals look pretty darn cool in the process. So let's head over to the desk and let's get painting. Okay, I have this wonderful Knight from Natalia Arach. This is a 54mm figure and I really love it. It's absolutely beautiful. And I was very excited to paint it, and she has this very expressive armor. Now, I actually started, you'll notice at the point we're picking up here, I started by painting everything else that wasn't the armor. And I did that for a reason. I wanted to understand exactly what the other colors were and what my composition was like so we could then establish the reflections in the metal. So today, here's the paints we're going to be using. And pretty straightforward. I'm going to keep this very simple. Effectively, we're going to mostly stick to variations of this sort of dark Payne's gray and lighten it up with this very yellow space dust. Now, we will introduce some additional colors later, as you'll see, but this is going to be the primary. We begin by just knocking in the primary highlights. With non-metallic metal, the first and most important step is just creating those high value transitions that show that it's metal and shiny. So I use the very bright space dust going all the way down to this very dark mix to create a nice run. Now, when I first start placing them, I don't worry too much about blending. As you notice, I'm literally just taking the different colors, the different mixes I have, and sketching them in. And that's really step number one. When you're going to work on these kinds of very expressive NMM, you need to understand where your light and shadow actually falls. So my first step is always just placing in a very hard value sketch. I work it in, place the yellow, the off, the slightly mid-tone, the shadow mid-tone, the low tone into the transition of the original color, and so on and so forth. You'll notice she was purple to begin with. That was just how I did a soft zenithal of purple and magenta. That was mostly for the skin, the hair, and the other elements. The armor we're going to be covering over completely. The key with this value sketch is it really helps you identify whether or not you're placing the light in the correct areas on the correct volumes before you worry about blending. You know, the blending of NMM is a long road, and certainly we'll spend plenty of time doing that. But what I'm more concerned with is making sure my light is correct. Blending is just an engineering problem we have to solve out later through lots and lots of applications of very thin paint. But if the value is wrong, if we have not placed our lights correctly, then the whole thing is going to fall apart. So I just continue placing in my highlights, blending them down with the darker colors, and then ultimately create something that looks pretty smooth. That, however, is only the primary light. The primary light is only half the story. With non-metallic metal, you need not only the primary light, but a bounce light. And it's usually opposing or directly opposite your primary light. So in this case, as the figure sits, the primary light is coming in over her right shoulder, so the bounce light is going to be coming up from below. In general, bounce lights are colder, they're more blue, and so as a result, because as a bright warm light comes down and bounces off the ground, it becomes cold and blue, which is kind of how physics works. And so we're going to take those opposing lights. Now, I could just knock in, like you saw me do in the previous video, some bounce reflections from the general light and move on. But there are elements of this figure that stand out as a great opportunity to do some environmental reflections, and that's what we're going to focus on for the rest of this. Let's start with her chest. She's holding this little tiny dragon baby very close to her. Now, the dragon itself is quite blue. Her hand is right there. She has this ribbon that's attached sort of to where the plate turns. So the first thing to say about environmental reflections is to remember that they are, in fact, light. Environmental reflections aren't magic. They aren't just that color appearing. They are light bouncing off of that surface and then reflecting as it bounces off of that surface onto the metal and then into your eyes. Effectively, we're taking one additional step. Instead of it just being the light hitting the metal and then bouncing to your eyes, it hits another surface, bounces onto the metal, then hits our eyes. As a result of that, it needs to be toned in that same space. But just like when we're doing OSL or any kind of light, we have to have a shadow separating that reflection from the primary light. If the sort of other color was right there in the primary light area, it would get overwhelmed by the direct primary light shining and you wouldn't see the reflective color. Or at least it would have to be super chrome and every reflection would be in the environment around it as opposed to generic light. So what we're going to do here is we're going to start knocking in some of these tones, and we start weak and dark. One of the keys is you need to be weaker and darker than the actual surface that it's reflecting. It should be fuzzy. It's not going to be a completely smooth thing, and it will not be, unless you're, again, trying to render chrome, it will not be an exact mirror-like reflection of what's there. Instead, with high shine surfaces like a polished armor, what we would expect to see is a subtle implication of that color being reflected. So you'll see how I make my way around the figure, placing some reds next to the ribbon where it's reflected, and it's reflecting up. Same with the little dragon. Where he is and where her hand is, we place a little bit of flesh tone, and then we place some blue. An important note, you do want to leave a small occlusion shadow, i.e. a dark line, in between your source, the thing, so in this case the dragon or her hand or the ribbon or whatever, and the actual item if they're touching. So where the dragon is like directly against her chest, we do need a small, thin, dark line on the other side there. The reflection is going to have that little occlusion shadow, same as what we have with a glowing eye or anything else. We don't want it to feel like one smooth surface that is just the blue of the dragon becomes the blue of the armor. That dark line breaks it up, makes it more easy to read and credible. Where we have a more distant reflection, like you see me painting in her arm, we don't need to worry about that because that's just her arm is sitting next to a red thing, and so it's reflecting some soft red on it. The key is we start dark, darker than the value of the reflected thing. Now, what we're going to do from there is slowly build it up. So we start using higher and higher values in smaller and smaller amounts. This is really just traditional layering, nothing too complicated. The key is we never go as bright as the original surface. There's always going to be one value step change down on the reflected light. So for example, with the dragon, I never go up to the like blue-yellow that I have as his highest highlights. I stop at just like the mid-tone pure blue. With the red, I never go up to the ice yellow or to the space dust infused red, and so on and so on. Once we have that progression in there, the key is then to smooth it out. And the way we do that is very simple glazes repeatedly over the surface, including, and importantly, a shadow glaze along the edge of the surface that smooths the light transition into the darkness. And that's really important. For most of these kinds of soft reflections and environmental bounce lights, it's not going to be a clean, exact one-to-one, i.e., they're not wearing a mirror. And so because there's some fuzz, because the surface has imperfections, that reflected light and color will be a bit fuzzy. So we want to make sure it fades out nice and slowly into the actual shadow, where it looks like it's kind of moving around in that shadow accordingly, but there is a soft, gentle, subtle transition out into it. Okay. So we just work up and down, back and forth, making sure that we have that nice subtle transition. You generally want to pick one direction for all of this to be working. So in this case, it's towards the figure is what I'm doing. Now you'll notice I put a little bit of blue also on the bottom of her armor under the dragon's leg, because I assume that there's some kind of light that's going to bounce up and hit down. The direction of light in general would be from the lower left, but some of it's going to hit that foot and bounce down. When we get that, we need to have very small volume highlights that we catch those reflections. And in fact, that's another key. If you ever are casting a bounce light like this, a reflected light, near an edge, that edge has to be edge highlighted in that same tone, just a brighter version of the thing, just like you would for any normal edge highlight anywhere else. Same rules apply, has to be in that color, and one value step up from it. Okay, so with that out of the way with the basics, let's do something a little more challenging. Let's move down to the legs. Here we have another wonderful surface for these reflections, because we have this big, broad pieces of steel or whatever in her leg armor, but then we have that cloak or tabard or skirt, whatever it is, I don't know, the cloth, right next to her legs. This gives us a wonderful chance to establish that light. So let's start on just that upper left thigh. There, I again do the same thing, just value sketching in some of those some of the light progressions, and then I proceed to work it and smooth it down. The key is to capture that red reflection right there. And in fact, I'm just going to move around the legs here while I'm talking. You'll see the various footage play. I work in very quick wet blends for a lot of these surfaces, making sure to just knock in what's going to be red, what's going to be shadow, where there's going to be more blue light, and where there's going to be more traditional kind of either the cast down highlight or the red reflection. We're trying to balance all of those out. Remember, in all cases, there has to be a shadow separating my primary light, the yellow infused light, from the red bounces of the skirt. So I'm always progressing from the red to a shadow, up through all the blue to tones to yellow, and then back down into shadow again. So we have this light to dark, light to dark, light to dark. Now, a note as we proceed down the figure. Because the reflected light is much colder, whenever we highlight, we can work in a little bit of, in this case, you'll see I'm just using kind of the blue, and I can make that be the, I can infuse some of that into the colors. And in fact, for the reflected lights, as you move down the figure, they should get a little more intense. Not much, just a little. With our normal light, that is to say our primary light, as we move down the volume of a figure, the light needs to become weaker. And you can see that's very much in effect on her. The light up on her shoulder and chest is bright, intense, it's this huge reflection. As we move down her leg, those lights and those primary tones are becoming weaker, lower value, smaller volumes. The opposite is true, though, for the reflected light if it's based on a bounce, because that's getting closer to the source of the light, i.e. the bounce of the light off the ground. So as we get lower, we want to make the lights a little more intense, a little more robust, a little stronger. And we can do that through working in both a more solid, saturated mid-tone of that color near where it would be reflecting, but we can also do it through the infusion of some of our middle blue tones that we're using for the bounce light in general, for the colder reflective light. You can see how I've worked all of that around to slowly bring this into place. I should state a lot of the work here is really just very boring off-camera glazing, but the key is if you get the placement of the light correct, everything else will fall into place as long as you're willing to spend the time. And in fact, you don't even have to really smooth anything out if you're not doing it for display or competition. It will still look completely credible and compelling in the hand to most viewers. All right, so we've talked about how to bring that up. The other thing we're going to do is I make sure that when I'm coming down with my primary lights, I weaken them. So instead of using the same space dust bright yellow, I shift down one step to a more weak yellow. So what's happening is as I go down, my highlight color of that yellow is getting weaker and softer and lower value and more desaturated, whereas the reflective tones are getting slightly brighter and overtaking. So on the lower side of the fig, that's the more expressed tone because it's nearer to the light. But I just continue working my way around the figure. All in all, once I have it all smoothed out, I'm pretty much ready to go. The real key with this is to just make sure you're thinking, imagine the light literally as a line coming down, hitting the ground, or something like that, hitting this other surface, the cloth, the dragon, whatever, and then bouncing to the armor and then bouncing to your eye. Where you can see those direct reflections, where you can draw a straight line between the two surfaces, that's where you need to place one of these bounce reflections. So here's how she looks right now. I've still got quite a lot of work to do on her, but I thought this would be pretty instructive overall. Videos like this are never very popular. I love doing them because I love sharing these kinds of like very complex and nuanced techniques with people, but most people don't watch them. So if you got to this point, hey, do me a favor, drop me a comment down below, just say the words shiny again. I appreciate it. If you can also, while you're down there, hit like and subscribe, that's awesome. We have new hobby cheating videos here every Saturday. Those kinds of things really do matter and help support the channel. If you want to actually use some cash to support the channel, well, there's lots of ways you can do so. There is our affiliate links down there to pick up your hobby supplies. Doesn't cost you anything extra. In fact, it usually saves you money. And of course, there's our Patreon, focused on review and feedback and taking your next step on your hobby journey. Don't forget to also check out my other stuff. I do my RPG podcast with Ninjon called Fireball the Gazebo. That's linked down there, as well as my indie wargaming podcast, Snarlcast, which I do with Uncle Adam. You can find all the links for the Vinci Cinematic Universe down below. As always, though, I thank you so much for watching this one, and we'll see you next time.